proper starting time. It's nice to have nice weather. I see it gets everyone in good spirits and everyone gets chipper and have all of these conversations, which is all good, but I think it's time to turn our attention to the business. So I'll call this meeting to order. And this is the special Board of Education meeting and open sessions workshop. And the meeting will be followed by, thank you, followed by a closed session. So the topic of today's meeting will be strategic framework. We'll be talking about the planning team status, update, and ways of working.
James, isn't Gloria the topic of the meeting today?
Well, Gloria is definitely one of the topics of the meeting.
Hey, welcome to the club, Gloria.
Yeah, we should say welcome. Typically, readings are done in the presence of board members, so I'm not sure why the board members weren't present today at your reading. So,
Will we be at the regular meeting, James?
Yeah.
We have 5 Mondays.
we do like to share in those things, so we appreciate it if you take us into consideration. So we appreciate that. Welcome, Gloria. So
welcome, Gloria. Congratulations. Glad to have you here.
So, but we're going to get started here because we like to try to stay on time as much as possible, and especially when the weather gets nice. So I'm going to turn it over to Jen to get us started.
Thanks, James. I haven't been outside yet today. Is it nice? Since I drove in this morning.
Say.
It's good. All right, don't tell me. Don't tell me. I am excited to give you guys an update on the strategic framework today. I'm thinking this will be maybe at most an hour. Obviously, it'll be up to the board's level of engagement, but I'll try to keep it real tight. I wanted to provide you with an update on the rewrite. Specifically, I want to give you a little bit of information about how things are going with the strategic framework planning team. That should be pretty short and sweet. I'll take some questions on that. Mainly, I want to talk with you about some of our ways of working, which is really about strengthening the ways we will execute on the framework in the coming years. So more on that in a second. I want to start with the update. As you know, we're well on track with the process that we've got going this year, and we're now during the planning phase of the framework. As you'll recall, the board has accomplished the bulk of its work. You voted recently on the vision statement, the core values, and the goals for the next framework. I thank you for completing that work. That helps us figure out with you what the strategy needs to be in order to meet those goals, which is what we're doing now. Here are a few pictures of the wonderful strategic framework planning team that is now doing its work. It's about 80 people. This time including about 10 students and 10 parents, which is pretty cool. There are a couple of pictures of students in there, and they're really quite a phenomenal bunch of young people. Our first meeting with them, which was in March, focused heavily on bringing everyone up to speed on the goals, vision, core values, the emerging theory of action, and we had the team really pressure test it. They pressure tested the theory of action against the vision, core values, goals, and they took a really close look at those priority areas that are emerging and tested them to some extent using the criteria that we shared with you at my last update. Now they're just putting a little more meat on the bones of the strategy, helping us go deeper and better articulate what it is we want to do in the next 5 years. I will tell you, I mean, my overall take on that first session was that generally people think that the direction we're scoping out is the right one. They feel good about the theory of action that's shaping up, and just have a lot of thoughts and questions about how to put it into action. There was a lot of discussion about relationships, building trust, building belonging, between and among staff, students, central office families. We talked a lot about investing not just in teachers, but in all employees. We talked a lot about our excitement and commitment to culturally responsive practice. And we talked a lot about keeping students at the center of our decision making. If there was a kind of a tension, like something everyone's a little confused about, it's how do we lean into more creativity and innovation while not losing the coherence that we've built over the last 5 years. So just trying to figure out what that right balance needs to be, which is, I think, the right conversation to be having. So all good there. I wanted to give you a peek at the priority areas that we discussed last time because they're sort of midstream. Remember, we're trying to figure out what is the smaller number of key priority projects that we want to focus on that will help set up schools for more success. At our last meeting, we talked about those. I got your input on them. And we talked about the criteria that we would use to decide on what those priorities should be. I'm going to show you a glimpse of what those priorities look like right now, midstream, and I'm just going to, fair warning, tell you the list has gotten longer, not shorter, which I think is part of the process. I think people just had to get a few more ideas on the table, and the goal would be that by the next time we talk, they've actually gotten a little shorter. So, our first priority area is still around deeper, richer learning experiences. So moving beyond just coherence, but into deep and rich learning experiences. That's still the thing we think, one of the things we want to prioritize in the next 5 years. This list is similar to what you saw last time, with a couple of key differences. Nikki, you brought up multi-dimensional assessment system
Yes, I
last
did.
time, and it's on the list.
Yeah,
I think
I
that
saw
really
it. I'm
resonated
quite
for
happy
people.
about
Oh, good, I'm glad. So it's captured here. We still need to narrow this list again, so we'll see what is still there. But I think the planning team is really excited about that idea.
Can I put catch her?
Yeah.
The multi-dimensional, not everyone learns through phonetic learning. So I was wondering if we could look at the different ways
Oh, sorry,
individuals
James.
learn at the testing, because you can have a nonverbal individual
Mhm.
and who understands the material but can't do the test.
Yeah.
So that's what that was.
Thank you, Nikki. So yeah, we're trying to figure out how we can make sure that students can express what they actually know. And some of our assessments are limited in that way. And I think the other thing is when it comes to intervention, that was on the list last time, the team has expanded that to really wanting to think about not just academic interventions, but social, emotional, and behavioral interventions as well. The second priority area is focused on building positive, trusting relationships. That kind of overarching priority area has not changed. When it comes to what has changed on the list, I think that there's been an addition, which is about restorative practice. So again, just wondering if this is something we're already doing, but is that an area that we want to lean even further into in the next 5 years? And then the last priority area is focused on personalized options for post-secondary success. And there's one bullet that's added here. That is the last one. The team has been thinking about whether or not it would be worth prioritizing working with schools to build new partnerships for more experiential learning opportunities for students. Internships, can more students, I don't know, be working at not just businesses, but post-secondary institutions, higher education institutions, to have interesting experiences outside of the classroom.
Would that?
Oh, I'm sorry, James.
Sorry,
James is
I
running the
apologize.
meeting.
I promise it'll be less than 2 seconds.
Okay, appreciate it.
I was just wondering, will that include vocational options as well?
Very well. I think it should. I think it absolutely
Sorry,
should.
Jane.
So not a lot has changed since last time. I think everyone's just kind of playing with this list and pressure testing and making sure that it's right. My hope is still that we have a tighter list by the time all is said and done. Last reminder is that the team is thinking about what it would take to kind of restructure some of the ways that we work so that we can be sure to follow through on our commitment to African American youth. Nichelle Nichols, who's the head of Family, Youth, and Community Engagement, has been working with a sub-team of the planning group to do some serious exploration of what other districts are doing in this area. So we'll have more to update you the next time as well. I just wanted you to know that that was happening. Our next steps, the team is now doing some small group work during the month of April. The full group will convene again on May 9th. It says here, and originally it was meant to be a half-day meeting. It's actually going to be a full-day meeting. We just realized that we needed sufficient time to do the work. And at that meeting, we'll be actually looking at coherence across all the things that we want to do in the next 5 years to make sure that they actually hold together in a coherent package. And we're going to be looking at what are the most powerful first steps in the first year of the strategic framework's implementation. Remember, the framework is a framework. It's not a super detailed strategic plan that fully articulates every single thing we're going to do in great detail over the next 5 years. It's a framework, and we need to get clear on what we want to do right out the gate next year. So remember, this will come back to you either at the end of May or early June. In board officers, we're going to work on solidifying that next update. And then we'll have a full day retreat with the board in June, which is where we're going to really go through the strategy as it stands at that point with the board to make sure that we're all comfortable with what we're planning on doing over the next 5 years. So that is the update just on process. Any questions about that before we move on to ways of working or thoughts? Would love to have them.
I'll give thoughts and
right.
start with that. And
Go for it.
Kind of wanted to walk in pages 9, 10, and 11 of it, and then some
Yeah.
kind of bigger things. And I just went on page.
I don't know which page is 9.
They're the ones where 9 is the one that has streamlined priorities at the top. So it's the
Got it.
streamlined priorities section.
Yep.
And I guess that, kind of pushing towards further streamlining, or at least putting in
Yeah.
the ones that I'm most fond of.
Yeah, tell me.
And so from page 9, I would say that strengthening the tiered supports and interventions, and
Yeah.
I like the addition of the behavioral pieces in there.
Oh, good.
And also, I think that explicitly in this context, not only the tiered interventions, but strengthening the support for differentiation.
Mm-hmm.
And those. So I think that in that sense, both the core and the interventions, but looking at that as the continuum. And I think that we can get, this is kind of the not really exciting work.
I know, but very
and
important.
It's not community schools, and it's not this, and it's
Yeah.
not that, but it's the heart of what's going to reach most of our students.
That's right.
And especially, as I continue to say, is that it's those students who are testing below basic and that who are my most concern, and this is the one that gets to them the most, I think.
Okay, good.
On page 10, the next page,
Yep.
very, very supportive of the behavioral health and trauma, as I've
Yeah.
said 100 times before, and more so than the other ones. And also, I'd like us to push a little bit to think about transitions beyond just the 9th and 10th,
Yeah.
and look at the transitions for our highly mobile students. Those who come in and do multiple schools within a year, multiple schools within
Yeah.
their career, and really provide supports around that. And I've had some, really, the beginnings of some really rich conversations with people from our TEP team about how that impacts homeless students, but it's not only homeless students. And I think that this is a place where we have an opportunity to do better. We have an opportunity to get there before they become in the at-risk category. And I would also say that this also, when we speak about the highly mobile students in this, also the transitions from people in and out of the juvenile justice system also as part of this, and transitioning back from expulsions to suspensions, which we're doing a little of now, but that kind of thing. So I think looking at transitions wider, certainly focus on all students 9th and 6th, but then find these special categories elsewhere where we know that these are places where students begin to struggle.
Yeah, even transition into school.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. On page 11, I have a question. What is school-wide AVID? Because AVID is a targeted strategy for particular students. And
I think that's a good question. Speaking on behalf of the team, I'm not on the team that's been working on this. I think that the way that AVID functions is AVID strategies can be implemented school-wide, and then the AVID class, right, and the supports that come with it are for this targeted group. So my assumption here is that they're really looking at making sure that the school-wide strategies are actually taking hold in a meaningful way. Mary, you might, I mean, you're so knowledgeable in this area.
I think that's what it is, and I think that there's from what I've heard, there's two benefits. One is that they're good strategies, regardless
beneficial
of
for
the
everybody.
students. And second of all, with the students who are in AVID TOPS, if they're using these strategies, but the classes that they're in, those teachers do not reinforce or use those, then it's harder for them to use those strategies that help them in their class. And so I think that's my understanding of it.
I think this one might be something where in the next session we talk about what we pilot and what we expand and things like that. That exercise and care that, you know, we've achieved success with some students within AVID. That doesn't necessarily mean that taking pieces of AVID out and applying them elsewhere that we have to be careful to see how that's working. See, and just because it works in this context doesn't mean it's going to work in that context. I guess is what I would say to that. The last comment is that as we look at these priorities, I think that we should consider the recent memo from Doug Keeler. And in some ways, you know, we have here about student and family engagement, we have student voice and things, and I think that if we want to pull a theme out of that memo, it was staff voice. And I think that that should be integrated into some of these in some manner.
I agree, TJ, and let me just say one thing on that, because I mean, I'm not only in large agreement with the contents of MTI's kind of platform for climate and culture, but remember, this is a portion of the larger strategic framework, and there's a whole section on what it means to empower school communities, right, through their SIP, through the school-based leadership team. We learned so much about what works and what doesn't over the last 5 years. I really think that's where the opportunity is to just tighten up our work around shared leadership, teacher leadership specifically, voice, and use of teacher expertise in decision-making. So I think that's an excellent point. James, I'll pass it back to you, see if there are other comments.
The last one that TJ was referencing, the Streamline 3, Priority 3, the last 4 bullets resonate with me a lot because it's where we can come up with strategies and real options.
Where are you, James?
That's the one.
This is the one?
The last 4 bullets all talk about offering opportunities and options that aren't available right now, that we are just really beginning. And I want to see those really in practice next year and expanded to give our kids more choices that work for them.
Awesome.
So I know that these are like the titles of stuff and the guts get put in later, but we had Ricardo's plan on opportunity youth, pathways is up.
Yep.
STEM thing will be starting.
Yeah.
Uncertain about the school-wide AVID opportunities we could have, but and then the experiential learning could, every teacher likes to do that. And if we could take some pressure off them for all the other stuff we lay on them to allow this stuff to happen, because what I know about it, when I did it, it takes time.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of time away from running a curriculum and your class, so and I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
Kids learn from it and they get excited about it, so when they're bored as hell with all the curriculum you give them some of this, they'll understand, okay, I get this over with, I can go do that, and it works.
Yeah.
So I want to, been on that one for a long time, but so there's 4 bullets there that I like.
All right, good to hear it. Any other thoughts on where we are with the kind of strategy shaping up?
So maybe 2 questions.
Yeah.
First is just if you had to like say out loud what your 3 biggest priorities are.
Mine.
Yeah, what would they be? Or what would the teams be?
Oh God, Kate. It's so hard. Like, I mean, these big priorities are
Okay.
mine. But when it comes to the sub bullets, that's what you're asking about? Yeah. I think that would be, I'm worried about answering that because my voice kind of has an effect. Yeah.
When this document gets written,
Mm-hmm.
and I hear you that
Yeah.
the work will continue to refine that.
Yeah.
I would love to see if it's a timeline of how we're going to tackle these things, so we have fewer per year.
Yes, that's part of it.
Something
Mhm.
that gives us a set of priorities that any of us could, off the top of our heads,
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
in terms of strategies
Yeah.
that we will use to deliver what we promised our city, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear
so
ya.
that
We'll get
I
there.
would like to be able to say out loud, off the tip of my tongue, here's
Yeah.
the 3 things that we're really focused on this year, or here's the 5, but like not
Mhm.
15.
Yep.
So that would be just the first push. The other, what are we going to stop doing?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
There's a lot of really cool stuff on these lists, and
Yeah.
I'm on board with all of it and then some, right?
Yep, I know.
But I don't want to. I want the team to also
Yeah.
push just as hard in terms of the work we're going to stop, the work
Yeah.
that we won't stop, that's at the central office will stop.
Yeah.
The work
Right.
that we actively need to pull resources out of in
Mhm.
order to fuel some of this. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a hard and long conversation that
It sure
I'd love to
is.
see just as clearly written down on a page.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's something to bring to the strategic framework planning group, but more importantly, it might be a good chunk of our June discussion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, however it happens, but in the final document,
It's got to be there.
it's got to be there.
Mm-hmm. All right, got it.
And then the last is just, and I think I've kind of thrown this out there in a couple of different ways. Is this enough?
Yeah.
Right? Is it bold enough? Is it, there's nothing on here about facilities and footprint and kind of dreaming big about what we could do differently, particularly around goal 1.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, deeper learning experiences, this is almost all around curriculum, which is
Mhm.
great, that's how we deliver learning, but we deliver learning in buildings, we deliver
Yeah.
learning with different types of staff. I just want to make sure that we are at least pushing our thinking around, especially some of the longer term facilities and kind of operational things that could
Okay.
really support
Yeah.
our learning environments
Mhm.
and youth. So
Okay.
those would be the 3 big picture things.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. Yep.
Just one quick question on Are we also including the work on universal design? Is that going to be included in that or not?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nikki, and I think we talked about this the last time we had this discussion.
Because I missed the retreat.
Yeah. Oh, shoot. Universal design is certainly part of the professional development plan. I think what I'm struggling with, kind of just name it, is that this isn't the whole framework, right? This is just like the kind of priority actions that the central office will drive at the center of it. And so I think some of the things that you guys feel like might be missing are just in the larger framework.
Oh, okay.
So I think that's where a concept like universal design fits. It's in our kind of definition of great instructional planning, right? And how we
Yeah, I
would be
can see
supporting
that.
teacher teams to plan their instruction. But it's certainly, I think, a focal point for us when it comes to our work with schools on instructional planning. Yeah. Thank you for reminding me of that, Nikki. Anything else? Okay. So, the process will continue. Kate, did you have one more thing?
Just the process from here, because so
Yeah.
this is the piece of it. This is our opportunity to weigh in. Will we have an opportunity on the other pieces?
You will. You will. At the next meeting that we have, which will be an update, I think what we'll likely do is continue our ways of working discussion, which we're going to get into in just a second, and we'll look at the priority areas again. In June, which is where we have our big day, that will be looking at the framework as a whole, right? Does this all hold together? Is it bold enough? What are we stopping? It's really that June retreat. It's going to be a big day for us, which sends us back to work, right? Before we come back to you in the summer with what I hope would be a finished product.
Yeah, and speaking of the June retreat, so it's scheduled for all day. So I think, I haven't really heard from board members. So I don't know if you have, but I'm hoping everyone is sort of starting to
Check your calendar.
check your calendars and figure out if you're going to, because it'd be really unfortunate if we schedule an entire day for this and have low participation.
Yeah, it's
So,
really important.
So
Yeah.
we need to know
Thank
way ahead of time, make sure, obviously things could come up at the last minute. But,
Can we find a babysitter for Kate? For Kate's kids. Barb, I'm sure we'll send out a reminder to everyone.
The school board.
That's right.
Kids at this retreat.
That's right.
Yeah.
TJ?
I just want to add also that when we talk about the process, that we still have to get the measures. And
Yeah.
additionally, just note that I in the last week or two, I read the Madison Education Partnership briefing on kindergarten readiness measures. And there's a lot of decision to be made just in that one area, and then there's all the other things that we kind of started with.
Yeah.
And arrived at, well, we know we're not going to do this, but we're not sure what we're going to do yet in the other measures we're using. So we need to have that on the calendar too. Is getting that
Yeah,
finished.
we do, and I'll make sure to follow up with an update for everyone on specifically the measures, because not all of that will be figured out before this school year. TJ, purchasing a new assessment of any sort takes lots of advanced planning, and some of those measures might not be in place for another year after that, right? We're not starting from scratch. We have a good, nice set of general measures that we have tools to use right now. But just as a reminder, when we launched the original strategic framework, we had to build a new measurement system over 3 years' time. So just keep that in mind. Not all of the measures, like an early childhood measure, will be figured out before the fall. Okay. Now let's,
Yes.
James, can we
Ways
move
of
on?
working.
Okay, I'm going to invite Andrew up to join me in this part of the presentation. And we're going to switch gears to talk about our ways of working. Specifically, how do I explain this? So in our first strategic framework, the one that we're wrapping up, those of you who've studied the framework know that at the end of it, there's a section called Ways of Working. And in that first framework, we articulated some new ways of working that we wanted to put into place. What was articulated in the old framework were the regular, like, quarterly reviews of progress, which are now just kind of a very typical routine in our district, but they didn't exist 5 years ago. Our processes for school visitation, which are known as the deep dive visits. Yeah, they weren't called that going in, but somebody somewhere named them deep dives, and it stuck. My advisory group structure didn't exist. We knew that we needed to get regular advice from key people, parents, students, staff, etc., principals. Those were ways of working that we articulated and we built to help us execute on the framework these last 5 years. So the good news is many of those routines are real and alive and, working fairly well, always continuous improvement. But we want to have a discussion about some kind of better and new ways of working that will drive our performance even more in the next 5 years. So Andrew and I were hoping that we could kind of scope this conversation out over the next several meetings. This meeting, we're going to talk about a key issue about scaling. How do we go about making decisions when we want to expand something in our district? We also want to talk to you about innovation, which we would like to do at the next meeting. Something that we've had a hard time defining for our district, and we need to, if we want to adopt any new ways of working around it. And then we want to review the review cycles document that we have that shows how we evaluate programs, etc. We want to go back to that and make sure that it's working for you. So we're going to do this in like a 3-part series, starting with the discussion about scaling. This concept of scaling, I wanted to say a very quick couple of words about. Most people think of it in a pretty simple way, which is increasing the number of teachers or schools using some strategy. How do you spread it, across more schools, more classrooms? We think that's a little bit oversimplified. And we went back to Cynthia Coburn's work on scaling, where she defined it in, I think, a more robust way. Like, it's not just about spread, increasing users, but it's about doing it well. How do you make sure that what you're scaling is actually changing practice? So it's going deep. How do you make sure that what you're scaling is sustainable, that the positive effects continue over time? How do you make sure that there's a shift in ownership, especially if what's being scaled started in a top-down manner as opposed to bottom-up, because it can come from both places. How do you develop strong ownership among the people who are implementing the strategy? So we want to be thinking about all of that when we think about how to bring something to scale and do it well. Our team worked on developing this problem statement. We're trying to figure out, like, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Because we have been scaling things, and we have been making decisions. What we think the problem is that the process for doing so is implicit, meaning that we have a way of working that we haven't actually codified or made explicit. So it becomes frustrating. I hear questions from the board all the time about how do we know when something is good enough to bring to scale? How do we know when it should be a pilot? Or should it just be implemented in phases over time? We think that confusion may be in part because we've got a way of working that's just implicit as opposed to explicit. So what we want to try to do tonight is make our thinking explicit and then test whether or not the thinking is good. So, because it most likely needs some work. And again, the problem is about scaling district level work, things that come from the district, as well as learning how to scale things that come from schools, best practices, innovations, etc. So on this slide, I am not good at making cool graphs. I'm really not, which is why you see this. This is me trying to get what's in my head about how we currently scale in some form on paper, so bear with me. The first thing I want you to see is that I think that when we internally are talking about scaling different things, we do it differently depending on what the it is, right? How we scale instructional resources, right, like our new math materials, we approach differently from how we scale instructional designs. An instructional design is like the decision-making around who's working with what students when and how. DLI is an instructional design in my mind. We do things different when it's a program, especially a program for a specialized group, so a program within a school. And we do things differently depending on whether or not we believe something is not proven yet, right? Some things are proven, and we don't want to do a pilot on something that's proven. We just want to adopt it and start phasing it in, as opposed to something that's not proven, right? It's a little bit different. TJ, if you could just hold on one second. Yeah, got it. And again, I'm hoping, I'm really trying not to invite criticism on my thinking. I'm just trying to tell you like what I think we've actually been doing, whether or not it's good or bad. This is just how we've actually been functioning. So we kind of have these different categories. We haven't named them until now, but I think this is how implicitly we've been functioning. So let me just say a couple more words about this slide. When it comes to instructional resources, our assumption is that they're going to be universally used across the district, that the math materials, for instance, that each school wouldn't be picking a totally different math curriculum. So because the tool that we would expect to be universally used, we phase it in through a centralized plan. We have the first cohort or cohorts voluntary. We want people to kind of sign up in the first cohort to help us get the kinks out of implementation. We get the kinks out, and then we start phasing it out over time. When it comes to instructional designs, we think that instructional designs have to be school specific because every school has different kids with different teachers. So the instructional design should be created for the real kids and real teachers in that school. When we identify an instructional design that we think is good, we create guidance and parameters around how that instructional design can be used. But every school's implementation plan is going to be unique because they're different sizes, they've got just different contextual reasons that force the implementation to be unique. And then programs, of course, because they're not generally used universally in a school, it's for a subset of students, we phase it in through a centralized plan just for that specific student group. When it comes to these promising practices, I think the way we have been working is that we use an initial pilot evaluation either to determine effectiveness, like if it's a totally unproven practice anywhere, like no one's ever done it, we have to prove we've got some evidence that it's good enough to scale, or we're taking a practice that's been proven somewhere else and we're adapting it to our local context, and we're using the pilot evaluation to figure out how to do it best in our context in Madison. And with positive results, we then decide to implement depending on the category above. I'm going to say one last thing on this because it's pretty complex. In my mind, the way we've been categorizing some of the examples that I put here are as follows. Pathways, as an example, in my mind, is an instructional design. It's not a program. It's about deciding who's learning what in what environment. It's about smaller learning communities, thematic curriculum. It's an instructional design. Who's working with which kids when and on what. Community schools, I think, is a program for a very specific population, right? You would never do community schools in every single school in our district, right? It's meant for a very specific population. And technology integration, we think of technology just like we do a textbook, right? It's an instructional resource. So we think about it in this very universal way. So let me just say, this is, a little peek into, my brain, and our team's brain, right? Like, this is trying to make explicit what we've actually been doing. So there are, I think what we've learned, now that we've been through this, let me say this. School districts are not really good at making scaling decisions, generally speaking, right? Like, I actually, with Andrew, did a little research on scaling to prepare ourselves for these conversations, and I invite some researcher out there to start doing research on K-12 school systems and how they make their decisions to scale, because it's very, very limited. What we mostly find is from the nonprofit sector, for example. There's a lot to be learned here, though. But I think we're learning something that someone should study probably about what it takes to make good scaling decisions. And some of those ideas are some of the things that our team has brainstormed up here. And let me just walk you through a few of them before we open this up for conversation. What I'm going to say isn't exactly what's up here. I think what we've learned is that we need to know that the thing we're thinking about scaling is something that we need, that it actually fills a gap or a need. Otherwise, we shouldn't even be having the conversation. Seems pretty obvious, but so often we look at the shiny objects, right? We go after them. People in education. The second is that we have to, up on the front end, be more explicit about when something needs a pilot and when it doesn't, and which of those categories, if these indeed are the categories that the strategy falls into. We think that you have to have a really clear design for the pilot, if you're going to have one, at the outset, which includes, to your earlier idea about what are we going to stop doing. Like, if it doesn't, you've got to be prepared from the beginning. If the pilot doesn't show good results, you don't continue piloting, searching for good results. At some point, you got to let it go, right? You cut bait. So we've been talking about this idea of measured enthusiasm. Like, it's good to be enthusiastic about the idea, but it better be measured, because you may choose not to continue it over time, and that's hard to do. We've been talking about knowing up front, or having a clear sense of whether or not you can sustain it in the end. Right? So it doesn't mean you necessarily have to have the budget figured out that far in advance, but you have to have a pretty good feel for the fact that you'd be able to find the resources, both internally and externally, depending on the strategy. And then lastly, I think we've learned that you have to have sufficient stakeholder support and enthusiasm before making the decision to bring something to scale. I think that's really important. You can see that there on the bottom. So those are some thoughts on what we are doing, some things that we should probably be thinking about as we tighten this way of working. And I'll just give it back to you guys. I really want to know, like, what, if anything, about what I just said resonates. What do you want us to be thinking about? Because I want to actually write something down for us, right, that we can codify as a board administrative team, so that we are doing a better job at making these scaling decisions in the future. So I'll pass it back to you, James.
I just have a procedural, and then I think TJ was after me, I'm not sure. But my procedural is on, no offense, I'm not great with terms always, but the word prove, what are we considering, what has proven to work and not? What is the consideration on what it is?
I think those are really good questions. I mean, I think what we've been doing, again, going back to what we actually do, is we do kind of a, when it's something that's new, that we haven't done before, we generally start with a lit review, right? What do we know about what the research says in this area? You guys have pushed us on making sure that we're not overstating it, that we're looking at the good, bad, and the ugly. and looking at where the kind of predominance of the literature leads us. And that's generally, like if it predominantly shows that the practice is working in other districts, we consider it, I don't know, a proven practice. If the predominance of literature isn't there, then it's not proven. Would you agree with that, Andrew?
Yeah, I think that's an early stage for any major program or any major experimentation, any major, I think the term experimentation is good here because it recognizes that things may not be proven, but do you have enough evidence that it's worked somewhere else and that the reason it has worked somewhere else has characteristics in common enough with us? So it's a fair comparison.
I do want to distinguish too. We're going to talk about innovation next time. I mean, this discussion is about only scaling when there's enough evidence to show that it works, right? Either from other districts as well as within our own context. We'll talk in a month or so about innovation. That is trying something that has no track record. And if it works, you bring it into this process, right? It's a little different.
Can you give an example of something that's been successful? For example, the reason I ask is that one of the issues I have in this whole education arena is that you always have so many things interacting at once.
Yeah.
It's just like we just had graduation rates for certain demographics to go up, but yet we can't really talk about why that happened. And so when we talk about success, can you give an example of something you can say, well, this is why it was successful? Because, one of my real difficulties in education is you can't, it's hard to pinpoint why something's successful because you always got so many balls in the air, so many things affecting it. And so when we talk about expanding a program, how do you know what really affects it? What's the determinant? Because it just seems like it's so hard to figure that out. And for me, that's really something that I think we need to have figured out, because if you can't figure out why something's successful, then where do you go?
I know.
Is it successful? So can you give an example of one of our programs that's been successful? What you would call a success?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about something specific that
because
would
we
be
cite
super
things all the time.
tangible
For example, we're happy
you.
to see graduation rates go up.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I think Avid is probably a good example off the top of my head. We do an evaluation every year. It doesn't mean it's perfect, right? I mean, that's why we do these evaluations, but largely successful. I think,
and so
yeah.
Why?
Oh, yeah,
And
I
think
know.
we're getting at the why.
Well, so this is the part I was going to say. So I think, James, in education, and Andrew, this is a really good point for you to chime in
people
on.
in science come out with really specific.
I know.
And so here
It's just, I think you're going to be forever dissatisfied, James. I'm just going to lay it out there.
Appreciate that.
I know you're an economist, a scientist. You want proof, which maybe that's why you mentioned this issue of proven, Nikki. But experimental design in education is extraordinarily rare. It is very difficult to do because you have to have a control group, and who wants to withhold a promising practice from any student group, right? I mean, this idea of scientific experimental design, it's just hard to come by in education. And it's just it's the nature of the beast, James.
Yeah, and because one of the other areas, as we've been talking about all these things that's troubling for me is that, when we get all the parents to come in, we have board members, everyone, for example, we just talked about today, for example, providing additional supports. You mentioned providing additional supports. Well, the word additional to me means funding, means some additional, unless you figure out some way to repurpose. That's the other word where you don't do additional funding. Well, everyone wants something additional. And the basics of economics is scarcity. There's just not enough additional to go around.
That's
So
right.
how does one do all of this when you see all this additional? How is that? So I'm just interested in the how. We're talking about, how do we actually do all of this?
Yeah, but I
So-
think this, I mean, in part, it gets back to Kate's earlier point about how do you stop doing the
I was
things that
gonna say,
aren't
I would settle
working.
for an example
Of stopping something.
Of something we've stopped.
Yeah.
I don't know of a single program pilot, et cetera, that we have looked at, rolled out, invested time in, and then said.
Kelly wants me to mention something. What?
The STEM work that we did with volunteers, we did stop after 2 years when it did not work.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there are examples. We had a big reading recovery debate around this table. I remember that. I mean, we could definitely, there's sensitive examples though, so I'm almost afraid to go back to the debates.
James.
It does happen, but it does take some real discipline. And I think that's partly what we're talking about here. How do we have the discipline to cut bait when something,
Yeah, because we're talking about
Hasn't been working.
scaling up.
Yeah.
And, okay.
that's right.
Dean?
You were first.
Oh, yes, you were.
Yeah, go way back. When I raised my hand the first time, I just went to, you were on, it's page
Oh, yeah,
19,
yeah.
which is the instructional resources core materials. Then I'm going to add to this. I just wanted to say that when we talk about making things explicit,
Yeah,
just the very notion that we're buying a new math curriculum or we're buying a new literature is less explicit than the initial decision on any of the rest of these things listed here. And so I think that's part of it. Just do we have a cycle that we do? Do we is it time for new
Yeah.
biology? Is it
Yeah.
that kind of thing? I think that needs to be made explicit too, because that's a decision, and those are very expensive decisions.
Oh, yeah.
Very expensive. Those roll out into the millions. And that speaks to resources,
It sure
I think
does.
that, so more generally,
and just TJ on that real
Yeah.
quick, when I started here, because I'm a CNI person by background, I did work with Cindy Green because we had nothing close at that time, and maybe it had existed to a curriculum materials cycle. It does exist now.
yeah, we do have a cycle, but
Which is about for purchasing new materials too, but nevertheless.
yeah, but I think even the cycle itself in some ways hides the decision making, because we have a cycle, and there was one decision made, and then it just is self-perpetuating.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a piece there.
Okay.
More generally, again, going back to what Kate said, is that when do we stop? When do we kill programs? Be they pilots or be they things that we have thought were working, or when do we move things 45 or 90 degrees from what we're doing, and maybe not kill them, but say, you know what, time for a mid-course adjustment, because this isn't going where it's there. I think what is really, really, really important is to be, and this speaks to James, is to, at the very start, have agreed upon goals and measures.
Yeah.
And that these will be monitored and agreed upon decision points, and then an agreed upon evaluation plan before scaling.
Yeah.
But just to, and I think that's got to be arrived at collectively. I think we have to be transparent about every step of it, and one of my hobby horses is that we have to be transparent about the design of the evaluations, and that should be a process that is public and should involve the board, because one of the things that that we get evaluations, we do an outside evaluation, and it doesn't answer the questions that the board has, and then the board has to make a decision based on evaluation which didn't ask didn't have the questions that we're most interested in.
Yeah.
Respecting that the administration has a set of questions that you're very interested in, but they overlap, but they're not going to be identical. So I think that the monitoring evaluation process has got to be strong, and I think it's got to begin with an agreement at the start.
Yeah.
And spend a lot of time on that. Not that, these look good enough, but have a discussion, and I think we do this. We've done it with some of the partnerships where we've had a discussion in advance, and we've pushed back and things like that.
Yeah.
But a lot of them, it's it's the end of a meeting. These look good enough, and then when it comes back, we're like, well, that's not really what I expected. And then we're in this place. Well, do we continue? Do we hit the kill switch? What do we do here? Because we didn't agree at the start what we wanted.
Okay.
And so I think that those initial phases, that initial phase is just so important. So
Okay.
that's my big observation.
Yeah, I think that resonates for me too, TJ. I think we've got to get much more consistent about that deliberative planning from the get-go.
Yeah, and to follow up on that, I think the idea of from the start is really, we can't stress that enough. Looking forward to sustainability from day one for anything that we are trying or anything that we're exploring. Really understanding what we want to get out of it not only informs the decision should an entire thing go forward or not in terms of spreading across the district or going to additional locations, but also then what elements within it. So we have a lot of things that we would call a program, which are actually a collection of them, half a dozen things, very clearly defined. We may find out that a couple of those are the things that are really making the difference.
Right.
And rather than try to grow that idea at all locations for all 10 concepts, maybe there's the power of 3 within it. We spend our time on those 3 and not the 10.
And
So
that's
there are
the
variations on the
45-90
theme
turn I
too.
was talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, you
Yeah.
know,
That's right. Yeah,
Okay,
that's
well, we
awesome.
can, this all sounds spot on when you're setting up the structure, but I think part of the evaluation has to also include the qualitative element of the staff that implemented
Yeah.
it. Because it very well could be that the increase in the graduation just happened to come down to the fact that the staff developed a relationship that clicked with a bunch more
Yeah.
students.
Yeah.
And invariably, it'll come down to that. So I don't know how an evaluation actually does that unless you can sit there and observe it for a longer period of time as opposed to collecting data points. Those are all really, really helpful, but we're dealing with people, and it's that staff-student relationship that is key to the whole thing. We all know that you could devise absolute perfect plan, but if you got the wrong people implemented, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
So that has to be considered as well, because we got teachers all over in every single one of our schools that no matter what happens, they're going to do great with every kid they got.
Yeah.
They're going to win way, way more than they lose all the time, no matter what gets thrown at them. So that's why a lot of our stuff in our school really working.
Yeah.
You know, the glaring weaknesses we also know is what troubles us, and it's everything that you three just got done talking about, but our priority of helping our staff develop the relationships not only with the students but among themselves, that was also
Yeah,
pointed out,
that's right.
and the principals and the staff with each other. Well, we get that at a high level in all of our schools, we'll, all our data's gonna, boom, just jump way up. And it'll be because of that, as well as the structure we put them in.
You know, Dean, if I can respond to that for a second, you're making me think about like the bottom-up part of this, which we haven't talked a lot about. I mean, at least on this stuff, we have an implicit way of working. Like we are actually doing something that needs to be codified and improved. When it comes to identifying school-based practices that deserve study and a discussion about whether or not they can or should be scaled is something I just don't think we've got a process for it, period. And, I mean, the closest thing, and it is a stretch, is every year when we do the annual report, we talked about this at a retreat not that long ago, we'll do kind of a profile on a school that's, just making more gains over time than other schools to understand why. But there may be something, getting to your qualitative point, about being more intentional about case studies, both classroom and school, right? What can we learn from them? I don't know, I think there's another way of working there that I think is going to be really important for our success in the future.
Yeah, and I'd like to stress the qualitative evidence is something that needs to be considered. So
Yeah.
user experiences is a theme that you'll see mentioned here, but then also in our innovation conversations.
Right.
How that actually comes about. We need to focus on users and get their voice elevated, and that is staff, it's students, it's families, it's community members, it's us. But yeah, recognizing that in a place where we're dealing with a social science and maybe less likely to have hard numeric kind of scientific evidence, you may have to go with, does it feel better? Did it make a difference? Does it feel like it's positive? Would you support that more in the future? And that qualitative piece has to play a bigger role in it.
So you're saying you can't have hard numeric evidence with social science? You don't have to answer.
It's more blended. Yeah.
Blended, yeah.
Okay, we are about an hour in, and that's about the allocation for this. So if anyone have final comments, we'll call for final comments now. Mary, you up first.
So Jen, I think this is
Good stuff.
Good.
I really like what you have here, and I appreciate you laying out the way you feel it sort of has implicitly been
Yeah.
done. I do think that it's really important. There's a couple of things with making it a more conscious practice, and also I would say a discipline.
Yeah.
Because I've been on, in the 6 years I've been on the board, I've seen different things that fit into one of these, and we are pushed by the administration as a board to expand and to move quicker when in fact that the evidence is not there. And so I think that is absolutely at the crux of it, is how you, the timing on and the discipline to stay in pilot
Yeah.
and not move to scale.
That's an excellent point.
While you prove the concept, work out the tweaks, gain support,
Yeah.
all of those. And
Yeah.
there's a few right now, right?
Yeah.
We're experiencing
So,
the tension.
so I would say that that's really important, because I will tell you, once you scale,
Yeah.
there are just too many people involved and too much invested
Yeah. It's
to
hard let
then
go.
pull it back.
Yeah.
And I really think that that's at the, it's just at the core.
I know,
And
I know.
it's a discipline, but I would say it's also a lever.
Yeah.
Because it's to say it holds people accountable. Yes, we want to support this great work. Yes, we want to do this. But you got to prove the concept,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And yes, it's going to take a little bit longer, but you know what? It saves us time down the road, because we will not spend 10 years
Yeah.
going down a path and then say, oh, I guess that didn't work.
Yeah.
And now we chase a different shiny
That's right.
object, right?
That's
And we
right.
got to stop doing that. I'd say the second thing that I don't see here is an understanding that success and failure is not, it's not black and white. There's just so much gray.
Yeah.
And what tremendous, like really successful implementation is continuous improvement.
Right.
It doesn't, it just takes really hard work. And what I don't see, we scale, and then we say we scaled. That's actually, the work is
Agreed.
is ongoing, and I think we have to understand. I've seen all stages of Avitops, right, for the
Yeah.
last 10 years. I've seen it. So I've lived the different parts of it, and I would say it is still, and it needs to, and in fact, I feel in some ways, I know the more that we press and say, it's that continuous improvement. Where are we not succeeding?
Yeah.
Where do we need to dive deeper? I think I'd like to see that added, that that process is, and it doesn't come easy. I'd say
Agreed.
from the time you decide to scale, it's minimum 10 years that it's still in that, maybe it's going from the infant stage, and now it's in the middle and teenage
never
stage,
ends.
but it
Yeah.
doesn't, right, it just doesn't end. And I think
yeah.
that's where I've seen a difference between I'd say school, certainly education, public schooling, any type of education, and nonprofits and the for-profit world, is that because your funding is so contingent,
true.
whether it's bringing in sales and selling a product, or whether it's in the nonprofit and your funding. You have to prove things much more on a regular basis, and you have to keep doing it. And I think we need a discipline. I mean, I love what you said, Dean, about the qualitative. This isn't all about quantitative stuff, but I think all of that has to be put into it, and that we shouldn't. I'm all with the things that aren't working, definitely, but I don't think we should in that time when we decide to scale and move out of the pilot, that we just have to work it right and understand success doesn't come easy or quick. But it doesn't mean we're not going to be watching and pushing towards that.
I agree. I mean, even in the pilot evaluation, you'll get a sense about the effectiveness, but it won't be perfect. There'll be lessons learned that have to be implemented over time. And I agree entirely, Mary, that we've got to get better at it. But I was trying to flag, and I should have said it in those third bullets, that the intent, as you're scaling and going to scale, that annually you're going through this continuous improvement process. I mean, I completely and utterly agree with that. This was a great conversation for us.
We have some board members' final comments, so let's get to those.
If there are more, go for it.
We'll have TJ.
Very final comment.
Yeah.
Two things. Number one is on terms of, Mary talked about the decision of going to scale. I think that there's also similar issues around the decision of how big we start. Some things we don't necessarily identify as a pilot or something, but how big it starts and those
big is the
issues.
pilot?
The second thing is that I think that, it's always going to be gray. It's going to be gray in terms of what's the causality. It's also going to be gray in terms of what is this truly successful? I mean, we said that, partially met goal. What does that mean? Which is one of the reasons why I think having those conversations at the start, before people are invested, is really important. Because you're always going to get the anecdotes. Oh, but it did great for these 7 kids, and so. To get at that gray, to make that gray, to find out where the decision points are in that gray.
That's good. That's good.
So just briefly, I mean, maybe adding on to the gray point, I think the best we can do here is lay out a process, not a kind of decision matrix, right? It doesn't work like that. But if you think about this as a stage gate process where you have filters at kind of defined touch points leading up to, I think, 3 outcomes. The first being we stop it. The second being we keep it, but we don't scale it for whatever reason.
That's
and the third being we believe this has district-wide relevance in some way, and we scale it. There's a couple of criteria in those kind of stage gates that I would want to see written down. One would be the stakeholders involved in the decision at each stage. 2 would be some definition around the live time. We think something needs to play out before we're ready to make a decision. I see a lot of variability there on that, and not good variability. And then any regulatory kind of implications or limitations. I think that may have come up in some of our recent experiments in ways that we might not have handled super well. And then the last would be around a comparison to other options to address the same need. So whether they're options we already have or could have, but so those would just be some of the criteria at those stage gates. I think we might be able to handle this in a similar way to we do our partnerships, so levels of involvement or levels of
that's interesting.
Formality around those stage gates based on size and approach. And then the last piece was on that bubbling up. So can we also write down a set of criteria for schools of when they are obligated to bubble up ideas, right?
That's so interesting.
When they kind of have landed on something, it may have lasted for a year, 5 years, whatever, but when we fully expect and kind of would ask of them to share out. So.
I love that idea.
I have one. Oh, sorry, I didn't get called on. I apologize, Kate. I did not mean to step on you. Just my one question is getting the stakeholders involved too soon. As much as I want them involved, and I do want them involved, I want to make sure we're not wasting their time either. I want to make sure that this program, or whatever program, I think our first stakeholders are our teachers. and we go to them first and we see how it's working and if it's implementable. Because if they can't necessarily implement it, then we can have the best program in the world. But if we don't have the people to carry it out, we're not going to be able to carry it out.
Right.
Then I think you go to the outside stakeholders and say, what can we do?
Yeah.
That would be, I think Kate's idea is a good one. I'm just clarifying that one little piece.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, I think we've done final comment for this section of our open session. Do you have any final comments you'd like to make?
I'll just say about next steps, what Andrew and I and other team members are going to attempt to do is try to get this on paper in some way. I really like this idea of the process and the gates a lot. I don't know like where that will live ultimately, but we have that review cycles document, and which is kind of, it's a ways of working document. It shows our evaluation cycles. I mean, it's super helpful. I imagine this could be a new section of that document. So I think that's what we're going to play around with. And we'll bring it back to you for further discussion. But I'm excited that we might actually get clear on how we want this to work for our district. And like anything, we'll learn from it. And I am not totally kidding. I think someone should probably study this because other districts could probably learn a lot from what we're trying to figure out right now. So thank you, Andrew.
Yeah,
And
thanks
we'll
everyone
wrap that
for
up.
everyone's comments. So let's do a
appreciate
smooth
it.
transition here to our BEP folks.
All right,
We're
perfect.
still in open session.
All right, let's do
Go
it.
ahead, while we're transitioning. Transition should take at least 2 minutes.
Never mind.
We will take our break outside when we're done. We're going to be done soon enough to take one outside.
Good weather is a good time to present it.
Yeah, right.
We stuck for him.
Give them a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
Because we know that the presenters have already got this thing whittled down to
Sitting next to you too long.
a very short period of time, so.
6.
I think Kate is finishing I think she's in the restaurant. Yeah, I tweaked my knee a while ago, so if I don't move every so often, it locks. And then I retwisted it in San Antonio, tripped over the cobblestones. I know. So every now and then, if you see me get up, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. It's just I don't want it to lock.
Okay, we're going to get started on our next topic, which is the behavior education plan. Always a very interesting topic, and we're anxious to hear what has to be said. I think we have about 17 slides or something, and
Yeah.
and so that means, you know, I was always told it's a minute a slide. So
Okay, there we go.
so if you could
Time
do,
us.
If you can do 30 seconds a slide, that'd be great. So
I think we can do even
Go
less
ahead.
than that on some of them. I'm going to take the lead on the first 5 or so, and then I'll pass it over to the team. Leah, Quinn, and John are here to help me tonight. We want to discuss some short-term actions focused on next year. We want to spend most of our time on key policy changes for 18-19. That's the major focus for tonight's meeting. And we'll just touch on a reminder about the big BEP rewrite that's coming next year. The behavior education plan policy changes are typically what we tackle every year at this time. So this is pretty typical. Back in early March, I think it was, we had a very wide-ranging discussion about the behavior education plan. I mean, it was about school discipline, but it was also about school safety at the time. It was about climate. It was a long, and I thought a really important meeting. I want to acknowledge that I made some comments in that meeting at the end of that very long meeting that were interpreted and I think amplified as criticism of staff. And, you know, that was difficult because it certainly was not meant that way. I made some comments about the importance of addressing smaller behaviors before they become big ones, the impact of racial bias. And I want to take just a quick chance to say a few things about what I've been thinking about since that meeting. I want to start by just saying, as usual, how proud I am of this board, of our staff, of our community for taking on this work in the first place. I mean, improving cultures and climates, but doing so by teaching instead of just punishing, by focusing on restorative practice, and through relationship building is really incredible work. It's hard and it's so important. I mean, it's right at the heart of everything that we do in the classroom. We've seen some successes, we've experienced some challenges, and we're learning every day, every month, every year. I've been having some very good conversations with MTI lately. TJ, you mentioned that a little bit earlier tonight. And those have been incredibly positive, I think. And I think we're all focusing our energy around a few things, which you'll see up on this slide. This acknowledgement that if this work is going to go well, it's all about building trust and relationship. And that's not just between staff and students, that's between all of us, right? Central office and schools, between staff, between staff and students. Those relationships are important. We've been talking a lot about how students will thrive in environments that are low stress but high trust. We need the same environments for our staff members to be successful. We've also been talking about what we hear our teachers say all the time, that our classrooms will function best when the expectations are clear, when they're collaboratively developed, when they're reinforced by everyone. We want to figure out how we can focus our attention on those smaller issues that happen in the classroom so that we can stop them before they escalate. That's very, very important for all of us. And then finally, we've been talking a lot about teacher voice in decision making. It's interesting to me that in education, we would never micromanage a teacher's response to a student on the academic side, right? We wouldn't tell them exactly what to do if a child got the wrong answer to a question. And yet, our work in this area tends to get down to a very kind of microscopic level in terms of behavior response. And I want to push ourselves on that, so that the people who work most closely with children are making the best decisions on their behalf. So I say all that because I think that what you'll see in tonight's very short presentation is aligned to these key ideas that we're all kind of gravitating towards, that are not only relevant for behavior work, but these are really important for the next strategic framework, right? The rewrite that is underway. So we're going to start a little bit on practice, a quick touch on focusing on the classroom, and then we're going to get into policy. I think that a couple of things. We want you to know that we see clearly that classroom behavior incidents are the bulk of the behavioral incidents that occur in our schools. This is in large part why it needs to be such a focus. We want you to know that these lower level behaviors, refusing to cooperate is at the top of the list, account for the bulk of the behaviors that we capture in our data. Yet another reason to focus on not just the classroom, but those low-level behaviors that can escalate if we aren't working on them in partnership. We have been thinking a lot about what we can do next year to support the work at the classroom level, especially thinking about this idea of staff and student voice. What we plan to do at this point is use our culture and climate visits at the end of this school year to work with schools to identify opportunities to authentically engage their staff in planning and decision-making for 18-19. We are reallocating, working on this, a good chunk of the funds that are in the professional development bucket to actually just distribute to schools. We tried this. I don't know if you guys remember this, I think in our second year, and we ended up taking the funds back because a lot of them weren't spent. But we think that was in part because we didn't understand enough about what was needed. Our schools weren't exactly sure how to use those funds at that point, and we're just in a different place, a different position. And we think our schools could really put those funds to good use through school-based decision-making. So we're going to work with them to make sure that they've got some school-based funding to play with. And then we would use the summer, early or fall to solidify the ongoing structures for collaborative work on school-based decision-making on school discipline for next year. Quinn, do you want to add anything to our thoughts on this side? We both got you.
Thank you. The one thing that I would add is that I believe the culture and climate strategy of being able to come together collaboratively and talk will really empower our school personnel to come up with a customized way of spending some of this money and hopefully engage them in a way that they see fit to do that strategy that Jen talked about here in the next month, which is staff and student voice.
Mm-hmm. And this seems to be something that our partners with MTI are pretty excited about too. So we'll be working with them on that as well. Last thing, just on practice changes, we want to remind you, we do have an implementation plan for supporting key aspects of our work on behavior education. Those are listed here, that will continue to be supported going into next year through our culture and climate visits and through the kind of tiered support that we provide schools when it comes to culture and climate work. Those things aren't necessarily changing, but depending on what the school needs, we'll be emphasizing different aspects of this work. Quinn, do you want to say anything about this?
I just think the shifts that we are planning for next year have really come through what we've worked with in the schools this year, which is there are 20 named implementation strategies right now in our culture and climate visits. Schools feel like, similar to the discussion you were just having, less is kind of more, but really targeted key areas that our schools want to lean into, and that has been from a through line of the visits this year. A lot of our schools are coming to the same consensus about what really is priority work, and I think you see that shift laid out here in this slide.
Yeah. I'll make one last comment on this before we pause, and then we'll go into our policy discussion. I'll send this to the board, but I recently read an article that I know I'm obsessing over a little bit. The New Teacher Center did a study recently on shared leadership. It's not very long, it's quite short, so you might enjoy reading it. But they talked a lot about shared leadership, principal leadership, and teacher leadership, the places where typically teachers have voice and where they don't. And even more so, where their voice has the most positive impact on student learning. The areas that they identified where teacher voice is likely the most important and the least used in schools typically are around school improvement planning, which is important. That's a really key aspect of our work in the next strategic framework. How do we make sure that there's more shared decision making and voice on the SIP? But the other areas is school discipline. So, you know, it's interesting, timely, and certainly pushing all of us to think more about where decisions get made on school discipline, especially these lower level incidents. Okay, let's pause there. We'll take a couple questions on this, and then we're going to dive into these policy adjustments. Any questions just about the kind of key focus on classroom level work going into next year?
Well, at least I totally agree that the focus needs to be on the classroom. There's no question about that. I think that's where we've seen most of the concerns come to the board and come to administration. So I think the
Good.
focus is in the right place. So what we do with that focus is another conversation. Okay.
Yep.
So, totally agree in terms of the focus area, and have a bunch more specific comments I can share later, but
Okay.
I wonder if this isn't an opportunity to use what we were just talking about around piloting and scaling to give
Yeah.
a small number of schools much more freedom next year that we believe have the robust capabilities, staffing, kind of instructional design, everything is
Yeah.
working together well, to give them some freedom to experiment with solutions of their own making.
Yeah.
And bring back after some period of time what they've learned. I just think we might learn more that way, and we might come up with some better solutions. So I don't know what you
I think that's really
think about
interesting.
that, but
Yeah, we've talked a little bit about this
Yeah.
before. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Kayla, I think there are some schools that are really ready to do that work, that would want to partner in this work, that have learned a lot over the 3 years plus of implementation, that can share success stories in the journey that they were on the year before the behavior education plan, or even a couple years before, up until now. So I agree with you.
yeah, I mean, I would love to see us push towards that as a way
Yeah.
of working, as a way to start to work towards the ways of working you are envisioning for the next strategic framework anyways, right? There's a lot of,
There's a lot of synergy there.
yeah.
Yeah.
Nikki?
The first thing, is the focus in the right place? Yes. On the issue of scaling, what I would scale is the fact that we have 70 pages of punishment. I've said this 8 times, but I'll say it again. That we have 70 pages of punishment and 8 pages of intervention. If we're going to have intervention and a true intervention plan, we actually need to not have teachers call for help and have the kid immediately return to class without actual strategies. I'm all for integration. I believe in full integration, but we still need to do our part. Second part I worry about still also is we're still going from level 1 to level 5 almost immediately. I don't, on complaints, I keep seeing that where we're getting level 1 and like 4 level 1s. So why aren't there 2? Why is there 3? What happened? There are like 4 level 1s and then 5.
Oh, that's so interesting. I haven't heard that too much, and I'm not disagreeing.
Well, could you
I'm
explain
just-
what you mean?
Yeah,
You
say
mean like
more.
the 4 level 1 infractions and
Yeah.
then they're at 5?
Yes. And I'm just wondering why. There are so many level 1s where, okay, this is a level 1, level 1, level 1, level 1, but there is no progression, and then they're gone.
Interesting.
And I'm wondering if there's a better way of doing that.
I think it's a good question, Nikki. I mean, I think that we've learned a lot about progressive discipline, and I think talk about gray area. Like, how do you know for sure that when something should progress from one level to the next? I think that's kind of tricky.
And
Those are good implications for the big policy rewrite too, because I think that policy, like just the sheer length of it, we'd love for it to be a lot more streamlined, much more clearly articulating the things that must happen when it comes to disciplinary response, and leaning a lot more into the intervention side. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, Quinn.
Yeah, and I would add prevention, right? So looking at frameworks for prevention,
Yeah.
positive behavior and intervention supports, right? Developmental designs, restorative practices are talked about. So when we start talking about school-based decision-making, what makes sense for schools, what makes sense for their allocation, their resources, the skill level that they have, and making sure that the prevention is clearly articulated and that that strategy has purpose and resources behind it.
And the other thing is, I don't want to move too fast. I've been a critic of the micro school. I'll openly say that. I think everyone knows that. And because of the speed that it was done. I worry, even though the parents agreed on the IEPs to waive the time limit, and I'm glad they did.
Yeah, me too.
I do worry that we could rely on that in the future, because we can't always. And I just don't want to use that as a common, oh, we could just get more time, because we can't always. That's my fear, is I'm going to get someone who said, well, I was coerced, and they really weren't. but I don't want to get us into that he said, she said, no, that's not an issue.
Okay,
I don't want it to become one.
okay. And you're saying this in part because of the suggestion of doing
Yep.
more innovations,
You got it.
school-based things, okay.
TJ.
I want to pick up on a couple of things that I've heard from other people. First off, I want to add hallways to classrooms.
Yeah,
And, you know, what I hear from schools, and, you know, maybe it's written up in the hallway, maybe it's not, and what I actually hear is the things that aren't written up in the hallway.
yeah.
That the hallway behavior doesn't make
Spills
it
into classrooms, yeah.
into IC or Oasis or whatever it is. So I think that hallways and classrooms, and I think that those environments need to be both there. This slide, the two places that really jump out to me and are the mobile response process and the intervention systems, and I think that they're very related and integrated. And I want to say a few that, you know, Quinn used the word preventive. I think that these are aimed at, done right, it's about preventing repeated behavior. And I think that when we look at things like the school-wide engagement and classroom expectations and things like that, that's the other piece of preventive. That's the, how do we create a climate? But I think our real problems are with repeated behavior. And I think that when we talk about where we're going to put our energy and where we're going to put our focus, that I think we're actually doing pretty well with the school-wide engagement, those preventative kind of pieces. And I think that, but I think that, you know, we've talked about high flyers. It's more than the 10%, but it is the repeated behavior. And Nikki kind of alluded to that we do have these, you know, level one kids who, you know, rack up literally, you know, 75, 100 behaviors in a semester. And often they do stay at
And
level
then
2 or go to level 3, and maybe they never make it to
Now I
level 5.
understand what you're talking about.
That's what I meant, I didn't
Yep.
But I
phrase it
think,
correctly.
I think that the preventing repeat behavior is where the focus has to be. And I call out these two, the mobile response process and the intervention systems, particularly at this point, because I would like deep thought discussion if there are policy pieces that can enhance these. And, you know, this goes to the how much discretion exists at the school level and how much do we dictate.
Yeah.
But are there pieces of these that we dictate at the district level that we believe are universal practices that should be strengthened? And then the second, beyond the policy, what we do in the policy we write, there's also, are there budgetary and allocation pieces here? And particularly when we talk about the intervention systems and we start talking about, you know, in-school suspensions, you know, I go right back to planning rooms, which we were talking about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, right?
I know.
And you know, and at some point we knew then that we were going to have to go there in a lot of our schools. And I don't think we're there in enough of our schools yet. And that's the preventing repeated behavior piece. So, I think that for you, both on the budgetary piece, whether it's reallocation of existing resources, not only professional development, also other staffing resources, and then are there, you know, take a deep look, are there places, even if it's just the language or the formal policies, where these two things can be enhanced in ways that what we know schools should be doing, we can be nudging them to do better.
Okay.
So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you, TJ.
Mary?
Yeah. I look at all of these, and it just feels like we don't know. Like this is a lot of things and a lot for everyone to handle and to implement well. And I sort of think that and I'll admit, I'm sort of thinking out loud. I really don't have an answer. I don't have something specific that I think is terribly insightful or is going to be that answer, right? But it seems to me that behavior are these, in essence, are we trying to teach this just like we're trying to teach math or reading? I mean, these are things, and that there's, and we have all these instructional coaches in the schools. Do we have behavioral coaches? Where, you know, we do have.
Yeah, we do.
And do they work? I just look at the situation, all day I'm around, I'm the oldest person in I'm the only one over the age of 26, right? I mean, we have young people coming into classroom situations where they have not been prepared. I mean, I don't think from what I hear, the education schools, no matter how good they are, do not provide a huge amount of hands-on time where they are faced with these type of infractions, just refusing to cooperate, not going to do it, just leaving school without permission. We're looking, and these are 22-year-olds. Right? And so how much coaching and how much support are they getting to know how to build that muscle, to know how to handle those situations? I mean, I don't know. And so I'd love to hear more about whether we are getting the support in the classroom for particularly our young teachers to be building those muscles. And I'm sure, Gloria, I'm looking at you, I'm sure when you first became a police officer and heading out there, and how do I handle this? And I'd love to know, because I think we have a huge amount of strategies here that basically are Band-Aids that in some, I think, TJ, to your point, there's a certain point of escalation at which it's not going to handle it. But I would hope that we are giving our teachers in the classroom as much support and coaching about how to develop the best strategies, so that we're not developing a huge amount of strategies that then have to be applied.
Yeah.
May I answer Mary's question?
Well, do you know about the behavior coaches?
I want to make sure everyone get on the table here, because
I apologize.
That's okay. No apology necessary. Dean?
Yeah, to join TJ's comments with the one in the middle, I think all three of those are linked. The mobile response and intervention systems, what's supposed to happen is the social emotional learning and the restorative insights. And I also, in the mobile response, the first bullet, I do not think that in-school suspension and planning spaces should be linked at all. They're not the same at all. And I don't think we should even call what we do in-school suspensions. It shouldn't be that. It should be what's going on in the SEL and restorative justice and the intervention system. And it just might be that that student is not going back to that school for the rest of the day. He's going to be in a place where he's getting the SEL and the restorative stuff that they need to not get asked to leave the class. So I'm not, the mobile response one, they're different. When we began the BEP, we thought that those planning spaces were really excellent ideas. And then apparently got some pushback from some of the schools. Some wanted, some didn't, so we left them up to them.
Yeah.
And following the scaling recommendations, we kind of let the schools
That's a good
tell
point,
us,
we did.
here's what it is, now you guys can take it. But we certainly are at that point with the period of years now with BEP, where we can certainly go back at it and review it really thoroughly.
Yeah.
And with your comments also around making sure the significant stakeholders are in place, which means the staff that have to implement it this time.
That's right.
That when we set that committee up, they have to have, the staff has to have some broad, equal representation on however we do this, either internally or as a board review with maybe has to be much more thorough than a board ad hoc. It's got to be some real internal looking, and our staff has to all be there to help us answer these questions. So that's my take on that gold and green and blue one there.
Okay.
Can we get all the slides on the table? Because, I mean,
Yeah, that might be
let's get
helpful.
everything on the table here
Yeah,
so we
because we're
can.
dipping
I
into
just wanted to
policy a little bit.
answer one really
Okay.
quick
All right.
on that
Okay.
particular. Mary, the reason why people aren't as informed is there's no requirement for special ed in a large number of educational degrees. There's no requirement to take any special ed courses. Therefore, some of the more challenging that are special ed aren't always taught.
We can certainly come back to this practice session. My takeaway so far is an appreciation for the classroom focus, possibly thinking about classroom and hallways, investing in school-based decision-making. The piloting idea is interesting to me, too. Okay, let's talk about policy, and then we can open it up to any other general comments. So we have a handful of major policy adjustments, and then some minor things that Leah will touch on. Next month, when we do, when we have the instructional work group meeting, this is where you'll have the actual red line, and we're actually going to be spending our time going through the red line to make sure that you're ready to vote at the end of May. So just be mentally prepared that that's what we'll be doing at the next meeting. This is kind of the first pass. All right, Leah.
All right.
Okay, before we go, let me be perfectly clear that Leah's and my relationship is going to be like Mary's and Mike's relationship.
Oh, geez.
So I need a clear, distinct, no long explanations
You
here.
know it.
So,
You know it.
so I've got from Mary and Mike here. So,
Okay, all right.
Come on.
Just put that on the table, full disclosure here.
Excellent.
Okay.
I'm up to the challenge, James. Thank
Okay.
you. So Jen talked a little bit about the overall policy revision process. The thing that I want to just highlight for the board is the reminder that in the year 2019-2020, we intend to be implementing Behavior Education Plan 2.0. And so as we're thinking tonight, what we're really thinking about for policy adjustments moving into 18-19 are those substantive things that really need to be addressed immediately. And you will see that most are related to safety. Just really quickly before Quinn brings us into some of the more specifics, that I just want to reinforce, because I think it speaks to much of what the board has been talking about, is what the purpose is of 2.0. And so the 2.0 is really intended for us to define and refine the critical components of implementation, work to build systems to ensure school ownership and support site-based decision-making, and then to Nikki's point and others as well, prioritizing the development of those proactive and intervention systems that prevent behaviors from occurring and reduces the need for those exclusionary practices. So how do we make the front pages be our most robust and the discipline be just what happens if our systems are not enough to support that student to change their behavior? So Quinn is going to preview for us in just a moment the short-term recommendations for the 21st. And then at the end, I'll just give us a little bit of a preview into May 7th and what to expect then.
So the first policy adjustment I'd like to bring to your attention is exploring alternative options and or recommendations for expulsion when we have students engaging in any combination of repeated fighting, physical attacks, and or physical force against staff. Some of the rationale for that comes through our culture and climate visits, which were referenced earlier in our discussion. 5 out of our 6 high schools and 7 out of our 12 middle schools that responded to a survey felt like this was an adjustment that needed to be made. We also have support from Superintendent Cheatham's Parent Advisory Group, and we did explore what the data would look like for this year, and it is fewer than 20 students that would be impacted as it currently stands. The next policy adjustment.
Yeah, I think we should discuss these
One by one.
adjustments very anything to say one at a time. I mean, because
Yeah.
they're,
Sure.
I think that's a good idea too.
and,
Well, there's only about 3 of them though, but
Th- there are
there's
two.
3.
but I think that they're very distinct.
we can do that.
I'm surprised it's only 20 students. I think one of the things is that I think that this paralleling or balancing alternative setting with expulsion is kind of a dangerous precedent. An expulsion is someone who has violated the norms to the point where they do not belong in our schools. And an alternative setting is something different. And I realize that with the alternatives to expulsion we've done, we've created confusion around that too. But I think that that's a little, I think we have to be really careful as we do that. And what this says about, I mean, we talked about last time, I think one of the last consulting reports we had on alternatives was branding, right?
Yeah.
And if alternatives are branded as, you know, we had somebody who, one of the members of the ERO ad hoc was like, well, Shabazz is where they go with the kids instead of going to jail, right? And that was the image. And this reinforces that kind of sense of alternatives.
Sure.
And I think that's something we need to be very careful about. Number 2 on this is that, you know, one of the things that I hear from people at the high schools in particular, but also the middle schools and a little bit the elementary schools, is the need for the spaces in the alternatives. Especially the special education alternatives, but the alternatives in general.
But middle school, you're saying, TJ?
What's that?
You're saying middle school? Did I
Middle
hear you
school,
right?
high school especially, middle school also.
Got it.
That there aren't the spaces for these students. So if we're setting up placement in an alternative versus an expulsion, and there's no space in the alternative, then there's no alternative. Right? I mean, and so I think that that's another thing we have to be really, really careful about. The third thing is that the actual language in the chart is the third time this becomes an option. Third time's a charm, or charmless. I would, if something like this goes forward, I would prefer that the progression was based not on strictly numbers of times, but perhaps based on days previously suspended, because you could have, somebody could have 3 aggressive behavior fighting instances, none of which are really, really bad. But then suddenly they're up for an expulsion, right? And another kid could have, 3 that are near-death experiences. And I think that one would hope that the kid who was involved in the near-death experiences got longer suspensions than the kid who had the others. So if we can find a different way to do the progression, and my suggestion is the length of length of days suspended previously, because I guess if you had 3, your maximum would be up at 15, except for unless you were a special education student, then you can't go past 10. But that could be as few as 9, right? Correct. This would be, I think it's 3 to 5 if I recall correctly. So some kind of metric that gets there a little closer to addresses, tries to assess the reality of the behavior a little more, instead of just 1, 2, 3. That's my suggestion.
So a couple of things to say to that. First off, recommendation for expulsion is an and/or in there specifically because physical force against staff.
Already is.
Right, and it can happen during a course of a fight. That does happen in our schools. 2 students engaged in a fight. The fight is broken up, and then the staff is contacted through physical force, and it changes the behavior and the coding of the behavior.
That's the only reason the expulsion is in
Correct.
there, right? We're not suggesting that this
Well,
is a
what
very
I've heard
important
from a couple of
difference.
students this year is, why are staff more valued than I am?
I've heard it too.
And why is physical aggression and physical attack on a staff considered an expellable offense, and the physical attack on me is not? So I thought you were responding to that. which maybe we should respond to.
Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's-
But no, that's,
the intent.
and that's what I heard was the fiscal, was, that was responding to that.
Okay. Yeah, we need to make sure that we get around the table here. Gloria? No.
I have already
The
called.
table recognizes Gloria.
So I'm not surprised that it's the 20 students, right? I mean, I think it is really about, we do know that we have a small amount of people who are committing the majority of our issues, right? And I think that we have to provide, if we're really serious about trying to get to the underlying issue with the behavior, we have to figure out alternatives. And I agree, I mean, I think the progression of expulsions, but we have to really deal with the behavior in a way that we get to the underlying issues, right? And for 20 students, I mean, that's doable, right? But we have to go all in on this, right? And whether it's alternative, whether it's a different placement, however it looks, doing nothing, it continues the behavior. I mean, it just continues, and what happens is that other students get involved. They're exposed to the trauma, and they then respond. So I think it's important to really look at those small amount of students that are causing the majority of our issues in a way in which we, don't rely on teachers to have to respond, right? Developing a collaborative approach of how we work with the students. It's doable, right? But we just have to really be serious and really wrap ourselves around it 100%. Right?
So this would entail a requirement that we explore alternative options. It kind of triggers a discussion. It doesn't necessarily mean that that happens. It doesn't, I just want to make sure I understand it.
Yep.
This is the way I do understand
Correct.
it. It doesn't necessarily say a particular length of time. It just, it depends on the student. It depends on the circumstance.
It does.
But it forces a pause, like we have to interrupt this behavior. What is the most appropriate setting for the student to be successful in? Right? Like it forces a critical conversation. I think that's the intent behind this policy change.
And I would add that I think it increases accountability at each level as well. Accountability for the school to make sure that they are aware of the number of times a particular student has engaged in this combination. Accountability for central office to make sure that we have supports in place for the student to understand the impact of their behavior. And so we look at it from that aspect too. And I just need to state, because it hasn't been explicitly said, this is secondary only as well. So we're not looking at 4th and 5th grade, which can have the suspension, but this is secondary only as we go through this. And
It might be wise for us to pull out the expulsion language completely, because if
I would.
if the escalation on staff, the staff, what is the exact infraction called again, you guys?
physical force against
Sorry,
staff.
Physical force against staff.
Yep.
If that's automatically going to go to expulsion anyway, I just wonder if it has to be included in this particular policy change. I don't know. Just to keep it cleaner.
All right, Nikki.
It's creating confusion.
Two questions. One, I worry on bullying, also on online bullying. You may have someone go and punch somebody. You don't necessarily know what the background is. You don't know if this kid has gone. I don't want someone who's actually the victim to suddenly face the same punishment as the one who was instigating it. I mean, that's just, to me, common sense, because otherwise you're protecting the wrong one. I worry, I want our staff to be safe. I think one way to do that possibly, and I've talked about this before, is on the behavior intervention plans, to make those, if the parents agree, and they don't have to, but if they agree, so that the teachers know about them and that the police officer in the school knows about them. That way the officer is safe, the teacher is safe, and they know the best way to react to the kid. because very simply, with my juvenile, I have primarily autistic clients. I'm going to use Gloria here. I'm going to touch you right now. The primary thing that my first thing officers do is that. You do that to one of my trauma kids or one of my autistic kids, you're going to get hit.
I would never do that.
I know, but I'm just,
Yeah.
you happen to be the
Right.
closest to me other than James and just,
James,
with James the president, so I figure I might get in more trouble that way.
So Nikki, to your point, I think part of this too is the zeroing in on the investigation process as well. Just highlighting this and making sure that we really try to dig deeper and understand the repetition, what's behind it, what's causing it. So again, I just can't go back enough to the accountability metrics at each of the levels to better understand this process. Our schools are also feeling like this type of language would just even serve as a deterrent, as a line in the sand, so that students do understand kind of where we're going, and there's an educational aspect to that as well that we would be supporting schools with.
And I just have one more thing, James, and then I promise I'm done. And that would be that just my typical knowing Maury, I am fine with it as long as it doesn't become a segregated environment. If it becomes solely segregated to get rid of a group of students, that's what I would object.
Anyone, any more comments on this? All right, let's move on.
So the next policy adjustment really speaks to just adding language. Felt like we needed to surface it to you all simply because of the seriousness of the nature. So adding language to alcohol and other drugs, that's a category currently in the behavior education plan to address this issue of vaping. That can be tobacco and or marijuana. We believe that there's a sophistication that is evolving with this. And adding language would help us be explicit in addressing this with our students and our staff to bring awareness, but also be some education behind it. So that's as succinct as I'll be, and James, I'll open it back up to you.
So maybe just on here, the language looks, I'm glad we're kind of pushing forward here, and I think we'll learn if it's enough or not.
I agree.
On the response strategies piece for AOD, I wonder if we can add in some language around what to do when this happens, right? So some of the commentary that I've heard is that the only people that really know how to deal with this is the school nurse. And that's not typically the first person that's interacting with these types of behaviors. And so who needs to be communicated to at what point in time? What are the potential interventions available? Just literally, what do you do, right? Other than kind of how do you code it? So I just would push a little bit on language there to help educate some of our staff people.
And I agree. I think through language comes guidance and some training that we can offer our staff over the course of the summer and before the school year starts.
Did you?
What level does this start at, and what's the progression?
What we would be starting at is a level 2, progressing through to a level 3 or 4. I don't have the specific red line in front of me, but it would be very similar to the being under the influence or possessing marijuana due to the potential for vaping to have and or, as it's listed up there.
So it wouldn't be, it would be treated as assuming that it was being used for illegal drugs and not for tobacco.
No, at a level.
Because tobacco doesn't go to a level 3 or 4, a level 4, does it? I mean, how high can you get?
No.
How high can you?
Interesting. So that's where we would, again, at a level 2 is where it would stay with tobacco. I appreciate the conversation. As we recover more of these, I guess, tools, there needs to be probably some community partnership with our police department to understand, like, what is in this, what's going on with these, to get a better understanding of it.
I understand that they're multi-purpose tools, but I do, but you know, I actually, a friend of mine's son, when they first came out, had some issues at La Follette with his use of them for tobacco. And not that I'm necessarily condoning that, I do think that differentiating between legal drugs and illegal and illegal drugs in our response and the tool itself doesn't differentiate, and I worry that, we are accelerating kids towards something that we don't want to. So I'd be, if we can find a way to, you know, if all indications were it was for tobacco use, it stays at a level 2 or something like that.
I would agree.
And again, if there aren't indications, then you can go the other way. That would be appreciated, and work with legal on that one.
Yeah,
for sure.
That
sure.
makes sense.
And so this is the last major policy adjustment, and we've heard from multiple stakeholders of just how important social media is to our students and the use of social media in our schools, in our community. And so we want to first call out that we want to enhance the code. This isn't so much like it isn't addressed right now. Some of the serious threats that have been made over the course of the last school year have been addressed through serious threats. We want to enhance the code to really start again, and I think the core fundamental here is educating by naming social media. Inappropriate use of social media that does include threats made against students, staff, our buildings, our grounds. So that A, we have a more systematic data collection of that to understand the frequency, but to B, again, educate and just be very clear with expectations for our students and our families.
Quinn said this, but I just want to reinforce that these issues were not going unaddressed or unhandled this year, but we really want, when we do a data poll, to have just a clearer picture of the specific type of situation so we can understand the root cause in a better and different way.
What's a data poll? What's a data poll?
Oh, yeah, so when we look at different behavior data, Nikki, we can pull behavior by behavior type or environment, that sort of thing. So just when we pull it out of data dashboard.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, how do we monitor this, or do we rely strictly on tips?
In regards to what, Dean?
Who's watching this? Do we have someone that's online with all these and connected that can, that a staff sees them, or are we relying on tips from students or other people saying, hey, this is, how do we actually know when a threat is made? Other than hearing it from somebody who tips us off.
Right, and we're relying on, I think this was a conversation that we had in March of students doing the right thing and naming something when they see it. So if it is happening to them or a friend, not being a bystander, that is not just a person-to-person thing, that's cyberbullying as well. So naming those threats that are made over social media, whether it is in the community or at school, so that it can be addressed in a space where we have trained professionals to really support our students going forward.
Yeah, because being someone that frankly doesn't like using this stuff, if you know, we need to see it to know that it's real. So we've got to see a copy of it and read it, because we just can't rely on people telling us. So if someone knows how to do that, that's great. And if the system is built for us to get copies so we can read it, good. But because it's very real, we know that, and I think I don't have a problem with this otherwise. But I also want to make sure that people aren't making stuff up. You know.
And actually, in these social media situations, often they're easier to investigate because of exactly what you said, Dean, is that we actually have really concrete evidence, whether it's a screenshot or a forwarded email, or even when I was at Spring Harbor a couple of times, there were voicemails that were sent, and so I was able to use that as evidence in a way. And so in many respects, I think we actually can make more objective decisions and reach a most objective result around this because kids produce the evidence for us.
Okay, Nikki, then Kate.
Just legally, I don't think we can have someone monitor the social media because of the First Amendment implications. I believe because we are a government public school and therefore we're a government agency until it goes to the level of threat. But I could be wrong.
You guys can evaluate that at some point. Yeah.
So I have comments on a couple of things that aren't on any of the lists. Is this the right time to?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Are we done with this one? Anyone
This is
else?
the last one, so.
Well, does anyone else
Well,
want to say?
Okay, all right. Is that the last one? Let's
Yeah,
get it
this
all
is
up
the
there
last-
so we can be
This is
done
the
with the
last slide.
slides.
Yeah, so the only other thing that I wanted to take time to mention related to the policy is you will see in your packet that there is that relatively large grid that we've used the last couple of years that indicates each policy change that we intend to make with its exact language and rationale. So when we come to the board on May 7th, we will actually be going through that document with you all to reach consensus around most of those ideas. In addition to what we've talked about, I just want you to notice that you will see in that grid that there are some suggestions of removal of unused codes. There's some clarification of language, some simplification of language, really working to make this the most user-friendly and digestible to our schools in the next year as we're in that comprehensive rewrite. So we are making a few of those changes around the edges that will go into more detail on May 7th.
All right. Okay.
So two, I guess, other kind of thoughts to throw out there for this, this version, I guess, whatever we're calling it, 1.1.
I was trying to figure out the number.
The first is around the use of electronic devices that are school-owned devices, in particular for games, streaming videos, pornography, right? I mean, there's sort of a spectrum of behaviors using our own devices that we wouldn't want, from things that are sort of clearly out of bounds to things that are not written down anywhere, like games. And so I just maybe would love to hear your thoughts on how we might incorporate that as it's essentially a disruptive behavior.
Yeah, so my thoughts are exactly that. I think many of those tech-based issues are addressed throughout the behavior education plan in different ways. Pornography would be addressed,
That's more
right?
straightforward.
Disruption caused through maybe playing games and not getting off the computer could go down to as a refusal to cooperate. And so some of it comes back to what we began this discussion with, in that school-based decision-making as schools bring on technology, supporting them in that transition. I know when I was at Senate that we were a G1 school, and that was a progression that we went through. You try things, you learn things, and then you try things differently based on what you've learned. So I think that's the type of support that we would offer schools in the district-owned technology.
I think also to that point, we have been, just from a practice standpoint, we've been in conversations with TJ McCrae and the instructional technology team, really thinking about how technology is used at school, when it's taken home, and implications for that as well. And so I think to that point, there is dialogue happening as well, just around the practice implications.
Okay. And I wonder if it makes sense in the policy to just really clearly state that the rules around the electronic devices can apply for if they're not student-owned, because I think sometimes the interpretation is that that's for cell phones.
Yep.
But that if you're on a computer and you could be doing something that's educational, but you're choosing not to, that somehow there's a different set of rules that apply.
Yep.
So I just wonder if there's a little bit of clarifying that we expect people to use our district devices in educational ways.
Yes.
Understood.
And then the other one would be around right now, and this is sort of just trying to get back at that question around how do you deal with the kind of classroom disruptions. Right now, we explicitly in our glossary pull out for classroom disruptions that it doesn't apply to side conversations and interruptions, I think, or something. And I wonder why. I mean, it's so gray. We're trying to empower our staff to make good decisions. I'm not sure we need to be so specific about types of behavior that would not fall under a disruption. Interrupting somebody is a disruption, and side conversations is a disruption, and there's a gray line about when you deal with it and not. But right now we exclude it, and I would love to trust our teachers to know when an interruption needs to be dealt with and when it doesn't. So I don't know, Leah, you're nodding.
I'm missing Dylan the timeline encyclopedia right now, because she'd be able to rattle it off, but and John, maybe you remember, if I recall, the reason that was added was something related to, and now Kate, I can give you a real answer for sure, but something related to, we used to use refusing to cooperate, and then we changed the language. Yeah, so something that is less judgmental, and I think that that was part of that overall change. Yeah, it's, yeah. I think we can get you a more.
So, well, maybe I don't actually need to know the history. It feels like it's tying
It
people's
just is
hands
time to
too much.
adjust, yeah.
And so as
Right.
long as it's legally okay and nobody thinks
Right.
it's a
The-
terrible
the
idea for
context.
some reason,
Yes.
that we could just remove it and let a disruption be a disruption. It's already really gray, right?
It all gets back to this idea of
Exactly.
letting teachers
I mean,
use
look,
their
we have to
expertise
empower
to-
people to manage their classrooms, right?
Mhm.
So those were the two specifics that I had. And then maybe just, for anyone watching tonight, I would go back to TJ's earlier comment on other policy suggestions we have, particularly around kind of that classroom and hallway experience. To the degree, there's a lot of staff out there and students that have experience at this point with this policy, and the more ideas, the better, I think, on this one. So please share them if anyone has any other good ideas.
Okay, let's everyone think about whatever your final comments are going to be. I mean, this is a topic we could go on for quite a while on. So be thinking about your final comments, Nikki, and then TJ.
I understand Kate's hesitance. I understand freeing up teachers' hands. The only issue I have on interrupting is how does one have a healthy debate on what constitutes interrupting and what constitutes academic discussion. I'm not sure some teachers would find one thing and some wouldn't, and I'm afraid that the penalties could vary widely. That's just me. Maybe it's just too much lawyer in me and I'm overthinking it. It can very be possible. But additionally, on the social media threats, I think we need to do something. And I would be for that because right now we're getting inundated.
TJ?
Yeah, in addition to the plea for thinking deeply and creatively about any policy changes that could help with classroom and hallway things, there's 3 areas where I would like to see or have language to talk about the next time we meet on this. 2 of which are difficult and probably will be unpopular, one of which will be maybe not easy, but I think will be popular. I'm going to put that one in the middle.
Good to know.
So the first is
Way to bury the lead.
the first is the issue of the students whose level 5 behaviors or manifestations repeatedly, particularly on the attacks on staff. And how that's being handled is not working for a number of families who are caught in that cycle. The letters going home, the very existence of the letters is problematic for some families, the tone of them for others. I would really like to see something integrated into the expulsion policy itself that would work for people. And I think that I have no objection to us recording these. I think we should be, as you know, it came out, and I think we should be, this should be part of it. But I think the communication with the families and how this exists in students' IEPs and records, that we can do better. And I think the expulsion policy might be where we do that. Or maybe someplace else. But I really would like to see it. And I know that, you know,
I'd second that.
Joanne has some ideas. I'm not 100% agreement with her ideas, but I like them better than what we're doing now. So if I had to choose one, I'd choose hers. But I think we can do better than that. Second, this is the popular one, is that I promised my students last semester that the next time we did the BEP, I would bring this up. So I have to fulfill this promise, which is that I would like to see language added to our dress code that was explicit about moving away from the gendered nature of so many dress codes and against body shaming. And it just so happens that my alma mater, Evanston Township High School, did this 2 years ago or a year ago and has model language we can use. And I think it's a statement we should make, and I think that the history of dress codes and male supremacy and all that is stuff we need to just get rid of. So I would ask you to look at the ETHS language and incorporate that, and we can do that. So that's the popular one.
Yeah. Thank you.
And then third is, I would like to have some language to consider to clarify 4400 and searches. And the application, and actually, and language where 4400 was applicable to searches where investigations include searches of persons or possessions, non-random searches. Clearly the lockers of the dogs and things, that's not 4400, but the other piece, 4400 is the, when police officers are involved in investigations informing students and families. So I would like to have some language to consider as a board to move that. And those are the three.
All right, Dean?
Yeah, I would actually go a little further on TJ's last point. And in the rewrite next year, that we consider very explicitly how police are going to be used in our schools. The work we've done over the last year in the ERO ad hoc has pointed out to us some glaring omissions of best practices that we could be using, and also asked even more questions about essentially how police should be used in our schools. And I think we will be far enough along to have that information and be able to include that in the VEP once we discuss the ERO report that will be handed off soon. And we can, instead of having it just as a contract that got sat there for 20 years with minimal review, it will be reviewed regularly in the BEP through an examination of policy and practice that is supposed to go with it. So as far as something to add, TJ's is a good start, but it needs to be much more extensive when we rewrite this thing.
I would agree.
Okay, I think we've exhausted our comments, or, no, we never exhaust our comments.
Exhaust ourselves.
But,
Good place to end.
but, you know, then I will be the voice of impatience. And I'm sort of in marriage camp, where, you know, this BEP thing and our staff, some of it seems to be so overwhelming. You know, we've been at this for quite a few years now, and PBIS, the science of it all. And I've always asked the question about whether or not PBIS works, because I think a good indication may be these repeated violators. If it was working, if we were using these interventions, and if the interventions were working, maybe we wouldn't, or we shouldn't have these repeated violations. And every year we do offer up new language in the BEP, and every year we're back here. So we've been at this for quite a few years, 6, 7 years or so. So I'm going to continue to be the voice of impatience, because I do think we have to have some solution to our classroom behavior, just simply disobeying staff and the relationship with hallways. Somehow we have to have a solution, and I don't know if it's in the just a simple code rewrite. I don't know if it's there. I always wonder how we include parents with some of these violations where we have kids doing this over and over again. I don't know what that process is, but it seems as though there has to be more involved than just the code and the kid. That somehow something else has to happen, and we haven't found what that is yet. And so I'll continue to be the voice of impatience, because we have to resolve this problem, because I still think that behavior in our classroom is one of the biggest reasons why some of our kids are not achieving, and we cannot allow one kid to disrupt 20. And so, so I'm concerned about that, and hopefully these recommendations will finally get us down the path to creating a solution to that problem. Dean's comment on the police and the BEP, that's something we're going to have to talk about, because it's a new comment, I don't think I've ever heard it before. And we're going to have to talk about that one at some point. I'm not sure that that should be in the BEP. That seems to be more contractual than a BEP item. And so, so that's something we're going to have to talk about.
I'd love to put it on the agenda. I'm interested, very interested.
We can always get that on the agenda. That's up to us. But that's something I think the board needs to talk about, whether or not that needs to be, or whether it even should be in a document that talks about behavior versus, because police are not in schools to deal with behavior issues. That's not why they're there. And so, so look forward to you guys' report so that the board have that information to consider when we have that discussion. But I'll need a lot more than I have now to merge the conversations of BEP and police for me to be in agreement with that one. So that's my final takes and my final comments. And so, Mary?
I wasn't going to say anything, but James, I just have to hop on what you said. But I think this, and it gets back to what TJ said with the students who have the 70, 50, 70. Like, I just think we have to, if there's changes in the BEP that our staff is saying we need to make to address those, to get them into an environment where they can be engaged in their learning, I really think that should be a super high priority. It should be for the 18-19 school year, and we should not be waiting for 2.0. We gotta,
All right, so the board is done with its comments unless there's someone, did you have anything you might want to add, Gloria?
No, happy to be here and just learning. And I know TJ wanted me to speak more, but I'm learning much enough.
You speak at the rate you feel comfortable speaking. Board members and staff. Board members and staff always have comments. I won't have any. You do your thing the way you feel comfortable in doing it. Do you have any final comments, Jen?
No, just thank you, and we'll be back in early May.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. John, we didn't ask you enough questions. We'll make up for it next time. It's been, adjournment's been moved. Second. All in favor of adjournment, say aye. Aye, we're adjourned. We have 3 minutes and we're being